While recent Daniel Craig Bond films appear to be returning to the long-running series' traditional appeal, it's interesting how much 2006's Casino Royale and its 2008 sequel Quantum of Solace depart from many of the franchise's established draws. Sure, there's still Bond as a suave secret agent, sleeping with beautiful women in exotic locations, while driving expensive cars and carrying German guns, but the campy action, wacky gadgets, and exciting set pieces have largely been scrubbed away. An action scene in a previous film might feature Bond driving a tank through the streets of Moscow, pursued by legions of Russian soldiers, while an action scene in these movies might involve Bond fighting only one or two attackers armed with knives in a dimly lit corridor or cramped hotel room. And while the explicit scale of the threat is much higher in the first scenario, it's only in the second that Bond, and the audience, seems to fear for his safety. Violence is less a spectacle we're along for the ride for, but instead often a harrowing fight where Bond is tumbling and scrambling to avoid the sharp edge of a blade. And nothing embodies this ethos of violence as a hectic, stressful ordeal where a second of hesitation can mean ignominious death than the approach to editing used in Quantum of Solace. This film uses a specific pattern of editing in essentially all of its action scenes, and its style is apparent as soon as the opening seconds of the film. We start with quietly rising strings over the opening logos, a beautiful wide shot of Lake Granada and the Italian hillside. As the camera pushes closer across the water, we get glimpses of the James Bond classics, beauty shots of unblemished expensive cars and guns being coolly readied. But everything is muffled, still intercut with shots of the serene Italian landscape. Then like flipping a switch, we hear an engine rev to life, speeding up into view, and a hail of gunfire. Immediately the editing switches, the music drops out, the cuts are frantic and from odd angles. We barely have the ability to understand what is happening, and while the editing pace slows down after they exit the tunnel, obstacles still appear on screen only an instant before the characters have to react to them. From a traditional action perspective, this is poor editing. It doesn't give us a clear view of the action or time to understand the layout of the space and what everyone is doing. But in this case, I think that the lack of clarity is an intentional trade-off, a decision to emphasize the feeling of being in the events depicted. One aspect of this is the suddenness with which these frantic sequences start and end. After a few minutes of hectic driving, we see Bond find an opportunity to reach for his gun, then, a second before his opponent can bring his to bear, he fires, and sends the pursuing vehicle careening off a cliff. And just like at the very beginning, at the exact moment the car heads off the cliff, the shots become long and silent, contrasting the noise and confusion from less than a second before, as we watch Bond's poor Aston drive off, alive but not unscathed. What this sequence does is emphasize the suddenness and intensity of someone encountering unexpected violence. In the glimpses of Bond's face, we see that he's serious and focused, but he's not in control. We see in the events and the editing that no matter how much a badass secret agent you are, one can't entirely make themselves immune to the chaos of violence being unexpectedly thrust upon them. That at some point all Bond can do is react to what's in front of him and hope he's lucky or half a second faster. The hard cut to calm again at the end of the scene also emphasizes this. The conflict that seconds prior was literally the most important thing in one's life ends, the adrenaline fades, and you're left back in the normal world to deal with the consequences of your split-second actions. Probably the most pure application of this editing technique to emphasize the brutality and chaos of personal violence is the knife fight in the middle of the movie. It's barely over a minute in length, starting as Bond goes to investigate the hotel room a suspected enemy agent is at. Classic spy stuff, calmly sneaking his way in. We, but not Bond, have a second to see a knife drawn, then an attack from behind, and suddenly cool, calm secret agent goes out the window, as Bond stumbles around, using everything he can to avoid the point of the knife. Then he finds a half-second opening, and a moment later a man is bleeding out, and Bond is again coolly considering his situation. It's not a laser, it's not an army, it's not even a gun. But for those few seconds we feel Bond's life is at risk, that his entire being is focused on not just dispatching the attacker, but on keeping himself from being killed. And what I think contributes to this is how short and snappy everything is. There's no fancy choreography, the fight doesn't drag on so that we can see a variety of acrobatic or exciting moves. It's just two people frantically trying as hard as they can to stab the other with a sharp object while not being stabbed themselves. Before we even have time to wrap our heads around what's happening, someone's already fatally wounded. Because no matter how much badass martial arts training you have, it doesn't matter if you get stabbed from behind or you fumble a single block in the moment. And the quiet death of the attacker makes us feel like it could have been either of them. That no matter how skilled or prepared Bond is, no matter how calm he is after the threat is over, there's only so much one can do during a fight to the death. A minute ago there were two men with goals, agency, and potentially years of training and preparation, and now there's one, decided in 60 seconds and basically on a coin flip. The benefit of this style of action is that, I think it captures the feeling of intensity and confusion of violence in its aftermath better than a clear, more cinematic style would. We see the chaos and the consequences, whether that's lingering on Bond's apathy towards a dying man, or a micro-narrative following a girl who is randomly caught in the crossfire of a chase. It emphasizes the stark break from normality these encounters represent, more than if the entire film was shot with consistently long, wide cuts. The more common alternative is capturing the forms of violence with sometimes phenomenally complex choreography and skill, which is exciting and enjoyable, but cues us in, even subconsciously, that everything has been scripted and acted. That the figures on screen aren't really all that serious about not trying to be killed, since they had the time to do a fancy twirl and flip before dodging out of the way of a life-threatening blow. This isn't to say highly choreographed, cleanly shot action doesn't have its place. On the contrary, I would say doing so is to the benefit of most action films. It's all about what works for a particular movie. And in this case, I think that this take on action helps characterize Bond in a way that makes him distinct and more interesting than previous incarnations. In previous campier films, violence was a given. It was presented in a way that we didn't particularly care when Bond gunned down a few mooks. But in the context of how violence is displayed in these films, Bond truly is a killer. Realistically, he'd have to be when part of his job is a state-sponsored assassin. And leaning into the psychological consequences of this not only makes him a more unique and complex character, but it forms the basis of a compelling arc through the two movies. In a sense, it's a character exploration of Bond as a contradiction, whose job it is to be a suave, smooth-talking womanizer, able to switch on a dime to fight for his life and brutally kill others, usually within a few minutes of each other. And in these encounters of violence, if we didn't feel like Bond was not just in mortal danger, but desperately struggling for control of the situation, if those he killed didn't feel like they were real people actually fighting for their lives, then the complexity of his character would feel unearned, and any exploration of it would seem trite, like a third act twist where Luke feels bad about all the stormtroopers he'd killed. If the camera didn't focus on the consequences of Bond's violence, then it wouldn't tell us anything when we see him coldly ignoring them. Bond isn't just a one-dimensional, unbreakable secret agent because people can't be. Because no matter their skills or jobs, people are human and can't neatly compartmentalize every aspect of their human experience. Casino Royale begins with Bond ambushing a man he had no personal grudge with in an office and coldly killing him, and Quantum of Solace ends with Bond ambushing a man he has every reason to hate in his apartment and sparing him. And that arc is only meaningful in part because the violence is.